Then we are going to learn more about this holiday and its customs in the New Testament and see the relation of the
Oh. Okay. Did we lose audio? Sounds like it.
Yes, I lost my audio.
I lost mine too for a moment.
Again, we're going to learn about the idea how the permanent can become temporary and the temporary can become permanent. Okay? So let's jump in.
Guys, is the audio working for you?
It's not working at the moment.
Maybe of internet, but it should be working.
Okay,
All right.
now
Let
it
me
is.
know. All right.
So now we're going to look together more closely at the Feast of the Tabernacles. These are the fall holidays, as you can see on the Hebrew year map, that starts with the Jewish New Year, known as Rosh Hashanah, literally meaning the head of the new year, which is also known as the Feast of the Trumpets, which is ushering to a period of 10 days of penitence and remorse, showing sorrow and regret, having done wrong for all the Jews, the people, to prepare them to the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, which is the next holiday, the holiest of the days, actually. And it was a day when the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, symbolically taking Israel into the presence of the Lord. Israel is now forgiven of their past sins and are prepared for the holiest of the feasts, the Feast of the Tabernacles, which begins 5 days later after Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. So the Feast of the Tabernacle, we know it continues for a whole week afterwards, but after the holiday is finished on the 8th day, the Jews make a big celebration and rejoice, finishing the reading cycle of the Torah, the reading cycle of the first 5 books. And then they start reading the Torah from the beginning again. This holiday is called Simchat Torah. Now, in the Old Testament, I'm going to ask to learn about this holiday from the Old Testament. I'm going to ask 5 major questions, these 5 questions that we'll learn together about the holiday. And these questions should turn out to be the keys that are going to unlock a whole series of extraordinary discoveries that we're going to discover together. So question 1, what is the miracle of Sukkot? Question 2, what actually is Sukkot? And question 3, which festival is the most joyous? Question 4, what's the difference between happiness and joy in the Jewish tradition? We go back to the language, the original language, to understand that difference. And question 5, which of the patriarchs lived in a house? So question 1, what is the miracle of Sukkot? They lived in a shed. Okay, so Bedouins, that's what Bedouins do today as well. Okay, we know that the Jews celebrate the miracle of Passover when God took them out of Egypt from slavery to freedom. So what happened then? What is the miracle of Sukkot? What is the miracle of a garden shed? I'm going to read some of the Bible verses to help us together understand what is this miracle. So yes, Sukkot is talked about in the Bible. I'm going to read from Exodus 40, chapter 40, verse 35. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. I'm going to read it in Hebrew. Ki shachan alav ha'anan. The cloud covered the tent of meeting of the glory of God. Okay, I'm going to read another verse now. Actually, we're going to be reading few verses together. And from Leviticus chapter 16, verse 2, God said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come at will into the shrine behind the curtain, in front of the cover that is upon the ark, lest he die, for I appear in the cloud over the cover. Now in Hebrew, ki ba'anan, which means I will appear in a cloud above the mercy seat. So in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 2, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. And to continue reading from verse 39 till 43, where later I'm going to stress verse 42 and 43. So starting verse 39. So beginning with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you have gathered the crops of the land, celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is a day of Sabbath rest, and the 8th day also is a day of Sabbath rest. On the first day, you are to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, celebrated in 7 months. Verse 42, live in temporary shelters for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in such shelters. And verse 43, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So we can see here, according to the law, Israel was to build booths of temporary shelters to dwell in for 7 days. And the main purpose of living in the booths, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, was to remind the people that Israel dwelt in these tents after the Lord brought them out of Egypt. So what is the miracle of Sukkot? The miracle of Sukkot is to remind Israel that the Lord dwelt among his people in the tabernacles, which stood in the center of the camp of Israel. Next slide. Now, to answer question 2, what actually is Sukkot? We will read again from Leviticus, the same chapter 23, and stress more on verse 42 and 43 to see the main point in this verse that actually tells us what is Sukkot is about. So Leviticus chapter 23, verse 42, you shall live in booths 7 days. All citizens in Israel shall live in booths. Basukot tishvu shivat yamim. Live in a sukkah for 7 days. Everyone must sit in a sukkah. Now, verse 43, in order that future generations may know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. I'm gonna read it in Hebrew and translate it to English. למען ידעו דורותכם, so that your generation shall know, כי בסוכות הושבתי את בני ישראל, that I made the Israelites live in Sukkot, והוצאתי אותם מארץ מצרים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם. When I took them out of the land of Egypt, I am the Lord your God. Let's have a look how the holiday continues, and this is a later period from the book of Kings, chapter 1. Sorry, the book of Kings 1, chapter 8, and we're gonna read the verses 1 and 2, which tells us the story of King Solomon consecrating the first temple. And verse 1, then Solomon convoked the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the ancestral chieftains of the Israelites, before King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of God from the city of David, that is Zion. As Ikahel Shlomo, or King Solomon convoked or assembled all the people, and in verse 2, Israel's entire delegation gathered before King Solomon at the feast of Booth, Bahag, the feast of Booth, in the month of Ethanim, that is the 7th month. So again, in Hebrew, V'kahlu el hamelech Shlomo kol ish Yisrael v'yivarech ha'etanim b'hag hu ha'chodesh hashvi'i. So on the festival of the 7 months, and this festival, this Hag, in the 7 months is called Sukkot, or the feast of the booth. Now to question 3, and tell me, which is the most joyous of all the festivals? Like we know we have Passover, we have Sukkot, these are the main festivals. So what is the most joyous festival? Okay, we know Pesach, as we said, or Passover, you get liberated from slavery to freedom. On that, you can rejoice, right? And give you full permission to rejoice on that. I would have chosen Passover. Or maybe you rejoice if God comes down from heaven and speaks to you personally. So on that, I will rejoice as well. But for God forcing you to live 40 years in a shed without a proper roof, on that you rejoice? So are you with me so far? Please pay more attention to this, okay? We know the book of Ecclesiastes was written by Shlomo HaMelech, right? King Solomon. And what Ecclesiastes is saying is this: I may think that I am the greatest king in the world, the richest man in the world. I built the temple. That's what King Solomon is saying. I've accumulated all this fame and wisdom. In the end, we are all going to die. So what's it all mean? The whole of life is a mere breath. You can have everything, but you lose breath, you're dead. That's finished. That's the end. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It's all meaningless, right? Would that cheer you up? Are you aware of how many times the word joy appears in the book of Ecclesiastes? 17 times. The book that we think is the most miserable has more joy in it than all of the 5 books of the Torah together. Now allow me to explain more. That brings us to question number 4. What's the difference between happiness and joy? So in Hebrew, the word for joy is simcha. And also the word for happiness in Hebrew is ashrei. We read this in Psalms 1, chapter 1, verse 1, blessed or happy is the man, ashrei. Yes, Judaism is interested in happiness, but what Judaism really cares about is joy, simcha. So what's the difference between happiness, ashrei in Hebrew, and joy, which is simcha in Hebrew? Happiness involves a life taken as a whole. I mean, you judge a person by the whole of their life, that they are happy, they are content, right? This is good. But joy, simcha, is not about a lifetime. Joy is about now. Joy lives in the moment. So, I don't know if you have been to a Jewish wedding. You go to an Israeli wedding and you will see the most magnificent joy, like in the picture here to the left. Joy lives in the moment. That is what joy is about. And even more than that, you can feel joy even in the midst of terrible things happens when they happen, when bad things happen in life. So joy is this unexplained inner happiness that does not depend on circumstances. It comes from within, from the inside. So King Solomon finally realizes, I'm not going to defeat death by accumulating lots of property and wealth and wisdom and writing books, because that's life as a whole. But I can defeat death by joy, by enjoying today and not worrying about tomorrow, living the moment. And this is simcha, this is joy. And that is how Ecclesiastes finally conquers his obsession with death. He learned to rejoice. Don't worry about tomorrow, just thank God for now. And that is what he did. So life is like a sukkah. Life is temporary, right? What obsesses King Solomon about the human body, it's a temporary dwelling. That is what obsesses him. It's not permanent. A human life is like a sukkah. It's not like a palace made of stone. It's a temporary dwelling. And what allows us to overcome our anxiety and insecurity of the fact that all we have is a temporary dwelling is J-O-Y, joy, simcha. Sukkot is about knowing that life is insecure, life is a risk, and that robs you all the joy, because you can never know if I'm going to be here tomorrow. But how do you deal with that? The answer is to rejoice in your holiday. You sit in a rickety old building, open to the wind, the rain, the cold, and the storm, but you rejoice. And that is what Sukkot is mainly all about. Simcha, rejoice for all the family, for all the community. Now, in question 5, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Which of the patriarchs lived in a house? Did Abraham live in a house? No, he lived in a tent. Abraham lived in a tent. Isaac lived in a tent. And Jacob all lived in tents. I mean, have you ever seen anything more extraordinary? And what is the Bible is telling us the whole time? Jews don't have to live in houses to feel secure. I'm happy to live in sheds in Sukkot. I'm happy to live there. In other words, even though you live safely in the land of Israel, today, never forget where you came from. Never so settled down that you become complacent, so that your heart is upraised and you forget where you came from and who you owe this to. Never forget. So just as you were supposed to remember the 40 years of wandering in the desert, now you begin to see this extraordinary thing. Don't forget how you first once had God living in your midst in the desert, in the tabernacle. You do not need great buildings of cedar and stone to find God, like the first temple that King Solomon has built. Yet you can live in a little porta cabin and still God will be there. Now we are going to continue learning about the Feast of the Tabernacles, more from the Second Temple period and the time of the New Testament. And we know for these festivals, the Jews have traveled on pilgrimage to Jerusalem whenever it's possible to celebrate together. And especially during the Second Temple period, in the Second Temple, more celebrations were added to Sukkot. For example, the preparation day, the day before the feast, where the pilgrims came up to the temple and before were coming up to Jerusalem, preparing all that was necessary for their ceremonial observance of the festival. And as evening sets, the blast of the priest trumpets on the temple announced the advent of the feast, which brings us to the first day of the feast. And what happens? All the people, accompanied by the priests, by a joyous procession with music, they're gonna go down to the pool of Siloam, where the high priest drew water into a golden pitcher. And on his return, he was welcomed by 3 blasts of the trumpet, while all the Levites chanted. And on that first day of the festival, in addition to the water drawing ceremony, the people gathered together at the temple, lighting large bowls filled with oil. So like big, large candlesticks that was so bright that it is said that every courtyard in Jerusalem was lit. When Jesus says, I am the light of the world, everybody knows what he's talking about. It's like the light of the temple that spreads all over the city. Then, this brings us to the second until the 6 days, the 60th day of the feast. These were called the middle days of the feast, or the lesser festival. And again, each morning during the 7 days of the feast, a procession of priests came from the temple down to the Gihon spring, okay, because it's a spring, it is considered to be living water from that spring that was used for the ritual purifications that the priests would take up with a pitcher of living water and returned to the temple. And as they arrived to the court, they're gonna circle around the altar, and then the priest is gonna pour this living water into the altar of sacrifice. So they did this each morning for the first 6 days. Then on the 7th day, or the last day of the feast, called the great day of the feast, the same ritual also will take place as every day, as the first day, until the 7th day, except that this time the priest is gonna circle around the altar 7 times instead of 1 time. So this ritual symbolizes Israel's request that the Lord bless them with rain for the next harvest. So this is the early rain that comes in fall. Because it's believed that on this day, God decrees the rain for the future harvest. And by the way, as we are in the Sukkot holiday this week, I can see the clouds and it's been like dripping a little bit. That's good because it prepares the soil. The soil is hard from summer, but this little rain like softened the soil, which is very important. And on the 8th day of the feast was the close of the festival and was observed with sabbatical rest and holy convocation. Now I will read from the book of John, chapter 7, verses 37-38, to help you see the relation of this holiday in the Second Temple period custom of the priest bringing water, living water to the temple with what Jesus said, that he is the living water, right? So on the last and great day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as scripture has said, rivers of living water would flow from within them." So again, this is a nice connection. Help us, people in the first century would have understood better historical Jesus than we do today. So if we go back to these customs, it will help us more understand what was Jesus trying to convey to the people. With that, we'll continue to the next slide. So finally, what is Sukkot is telling us? As we all know, the tabernacle is the name of the tent that God ordered to establish in the desert. And as long as they were in camp, like the cloud was over the tabernacle, and when it moved beyond, then it was time for them to travel on. So the tabernacle was a kind of a temporary dwelling. Then that the tabernacle came to be the temple, God's presence, the first temple, and later the second temple as well. So Sukkot is when the Israelites went to the temples and celebrated the produce of the fields, and they thanked God, all right, and for the harvest, and they would never forget where they came from. So because every time a nation forgets its youth, actually its childhood, or forgets the hard times they had when they were struggling to make a go, they become decadent or corrupt, and they eventually decline and fall. So, but Jews are not allowed to do that, because it's enough that if you live in a temporary residence and you're always trying to enjoy your life, no matter how difficult it may become. So we know that the temple was a permanent dwelling, and yet it was destroyed. So both temples that we don't have anymore. But the tabernacle means God is everywhere, or Sukkot became the symbol of God dwelling amidst us. So that became the permanent symbol. So it's enough. Don't think you got a great big temple as good as the Egyptians, the longest dynasty through our history, the Nile River, or like temple as in Mesopotamia, the two big rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These are the big empires. But I tell you, I am good enough with the tabernacle, okay? I'm good enough with the sukkah, with the shed. that memory of the tabernacle is good enough for me. That's what God is the point that I'm trying to help you understand what God is telling his people. So just as the Lord was with the people as they escaped bondage and wandered in the wilderness for a long period, so too is God, our Savior, is in us today, as we seek our shelter from our worldly cares and troubles. So God giving us these moments of joy to overcome. So he will always dwell with us if we let him as we journey towards our promised land. So this is the meaning beyond. The temporary became permanent, and the permanent turned out only to be temporary. Great, we're almost done. Here are some fun facts about this holiday. Fun fact number one, this holiday starts as the full moon, at the full moon. And it's very common for Jewish holidays to begin during the full moon, because in ancient times, this is the best way to come together in the evening when there was an artificial good light. And it's also to remind us again about this connection to the natural world, and that the dwelling in booths was to be a reminder of the fatherly care and the protection of God while Israel was journeying from Egypt to Canaan. So it's ordained that the booth must be detached and temporary habitation, constructed for the festival, and must be like that thatched as to admit like the view of the sky and the stars as well. And fun fact two, the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot is the final of the 3 Jewish feasts that is celebrated at the harvest. So it is one of the 3 pilgrimage fall festivals in the Jewish calendar, and these are very much linked to the harvest time in ancient days. So the Sukkot holiday occurs 5 days after the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, which occurs very shortly after the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah. So it's a lot of high holidays, months of holidays, and the climax of these holidays is celebrating the end of the harvest, Sukkot. Now, fun fact 3, it is a very home-based holiday. And one of the mitzvot or the good deeds of this holiday is to invite guests into your sukkah. So it's meant to be very joyful and include people to come in and celebrate the holiday with you. So a major aspect of this idea of inviting guests is literally as to call our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to join you metaphorically in your sukkah. And this adds to this idea of holiness and joyfulness and spirituality of the holiday. And mainly having a meal together or with someone is the essence of fellowship in our land here in the Near East. So again, this holiday is meant to focus on what's important versus what's temporary. And part of the aspect of building this temporary shelter or dwelling is to remind us about the things that can come and go versus what's important and what to hold on to, like your family and your friends, that you are celebrating each day together versus the impermanence of our material world, all right? So yes, there is the idea of temporariness, but it's also more importantly, the idea of openness. So the sukkah should have three sides, and the fourth side should be completely open. And that speaks to this philosophy and importance of welcoming others into the sukkah and welcoming guests. So this is the time, this is important to remind you to be open, to open your heart and your mind to the other, to the guests, to the people who do not feel included. So if there are people in your community, whatever is the otherness in them, like this holiday encourages you to use it to open like your sukkah, and how we can all become exclusive together. And fun fact 4, there are 4 species for the holiday, and these 4 species represent aspects of our human body. For example, here you can see the picture, the 4 species of the holiday. For example, the myrtle represents the eyes, the willow represents the lips, the etrog, the heart, which is a kind of citrus fruit, and the lulav or the palm represents the spine. So we read actually about these fruits in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 40. So all the Jews attired in festive garments, they go to the synagogue, holding with them the 4 fruits in their hands. And the elders march around the scroll, the scripture, in the center of the synagogue. And the people, like the rest of the people, they're gonna carry they're gonna wave, they're gonna wave their palm branches, and as well gonna smell their citrus fruit, and they're gonna as well chant together Hosanna around the altar. So basically you have the green of the lulav, the etrog, and then you have the shaky palm branch. So you meant like to smell and to shake and to rejoice all around the scripture, the scrolls. And fact number 5. Yes, building a sukkah can get a bit expensive before it is ready. So you have to buy the natural fronds, like the palm branches you can see here in the picture, in one of the religious neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And here you can see people rejoicing around the Torah during the holiday at the Wailing Wall, the Western Wailing Wall. So these palm branches you put on top of the sukkah. So there's some effort and cost associated with that, especially the sukkah kit to get these 4 elements. And some synagogues do sell them, but also local Jewish shops do sell them. But it depends where you live, so you have to invest, and there is a cost. Can get a couple of $1,000, depending on the area where you live in, before you get your sukkah ready to invite your family and friends in. So to summarize the theological significance of Sukkot, as we learned this basic, profound moral, that even though the world sometimes seems very dark and full of danger, and even especially in our days, and even though we all worry about our health or how many years I have left, Sukkot says, or the Feast of the Tabernacle says, you can experience eternity in a moment. All you have to do is celebrate, is simcha, to stay joyful. And you do not need a magnificent building to invite guests. All you do is build a shed, right? And you will have the founding fathers of the Jewish people. You have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob themselves personally visiting and trying to taste from your delicious honey cake that you prepared. So one way or another, all you need to do is to love one another, right? And turn our faces to one another and have enough faith in God that this temporary life and this temporary dwelling will become filled with the clouds of glory, right? So I put them into 3 M's. The midbar, more or less, is when God, means a desert in Hebrew, when God brought the nation out of Egypt, and now he has a visible sign that he is with his people, and he gives Moses instructions to make him the tabernacle for God to have a home with his people, and God will guide his people, will be with them wherever they go. So God encouraged Moses to gather all the men, women, and children, along with the foreigners of their lands, so they could learn to fear the Lord. Even way back, God was training Israel to be a light for the nations. Like he desired to dwell with them during the Feast of Tabernacles. And such a reminder of God's loving and that Israel should depend on him would naturally keep the Israelites from pride and from conceit or self-admiration. And then we know in the Mishkan is God's presence in the first temple and the second temple. So the tabernacle is the physical shadow that God wants to dwell in us. But now we don't have
Lost it. We've lost you again.
God dwelt with his people in a temple where he chooses a people to the internal, all right? So God is for everyone who believes in his son today. So from the external to the local to the internal, living in us, giving us this joy. And when we have this joy, we have these 3 P's, okay? Where we see through all history, God's presence, his protection, and his provision for his people. He never left them. So it's a beautiful invitation to all of us to dwell with him forever. And now that's something we all celebrate together. The joy and the peace of God in us. So I hope we have seen in this webinar, through some of the resources that I went through, some aspects of Sukkot that we never have seen before. So blessings from Jerusalem. Have a good holiday.
Hi, everyone. And thank you all for your time, for joining this webinar.
See you, Tony. Thank you very much. That was phenomenal.
Yeah, I was not able to be with you all the time because I'm on tour. I'm just checking